In colonial Rhode Island, where the streets of Providence were still crude paths between wooden buildings, one stone institution stood apart. The St. Casimir Academy for Boys was built with foreign funds and guarded by clerical secrecy. Between 1742 and 1754, 12 boys vanished without public explanation. Their names were struck from records. Their families, often recent arrivals or orphaned, received few answers. At the time, few questioned it. But archival traces remain. Testimonies, letters, and a hidden ledger suggest a pattern obscured by clerical procedures and transatlantic correspondence. What remains now is not proof of harm, but of omission. Founded under a colonial charter with permission from both the Bishop of Quebec and a British magistrate, the St. Casimir Academy was the only Catholic boarding school in Providence before American independence. Built of limestone hauled from Narragansett quarries, the campus housed both educators and seminarians in training. By design, most faculty were imported from Europe and rotated back within 5 years. Enrollment was limited to boys aged 9 to 13, primarily from immigrant communities. The academy published religious textbooks and was praised for its order. Few outsiders knew the internal routines. When questions arose in later years, institutional memory had already been erased. The boys who vanished never received commemorations. No investigations followed. The Academy's surviving records list them only in margin notes. The institution's reputation. The St. Casimir Academy for Boys opened in the spring of 1742 under the authority of Father Lionel Besson, a French cleric sent from Lower Canada. His appointment came directly from the bishopric, bypassing local channels. That alone made the academy a curiosity in Providence, a colony known more for dissenting Protestantism than for imported Catholic order. Besson had obtained a land grant by appealing to an English official who had economic ties to Montreal. With an exemption from colonial property restrictions, construction began quietly just outside Providence's central district. The school was operational within 14 months, housed in a 3-story structure with dormitories, chapel, kitchen, and adjoining farmland. From the start, the academy's presence stirred little public notice. The colony's population was scattered, and many citizens focused on agriculture, trade, or survival. Few saw the boarding school as anything more than a private concern. Catholic institutions, while rare, were not unheard of, and many colonists welcomed any structured environment that could educate children beyond apprenticeship. The school enrolled boys from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and further north. Most students were sons of French-speaking settlers or Irish indentured families. St. Casimir offered board, instruction, and religious education in exchange for labor or small payment. Its model resembled a monastic apprenticeship more than a traditional school. Within its first 5 years, St. Casimir developed a reputation for discipline. Boys awoke before dawn, recited Latin prayers, and were taught scripture, arithmetic, and agriculture. The priests maintained a detailed routine, and many students worked in the school's garden plots or kitchen. Letters written by visiting clergy described the academy as self-sustaining and orderly. What few external records survive describe the academy in neutral terms. Parish letters refer to "our house in Providence," and Quebec officials noted "commendable order." No known visitor reports complaints or impropriety. The academy printed no newsletters, had no alumni functions, and did not promote itself outside of church networks. Its silence was part of its model. By 1746, enrollment had stabilized at approximately 60 boys. The faculty, numbering no more than 12 at any time, lived on site. Among them were priests in training who served under Besson and followed internal promotion rules. The lack of lay oversight made the academy administratively opaque. Its internal decisions were not subject to colonial review. Providence authorities, for their part, rarely interfered. The colonial charter allowed private religious instruction so long as it did not disrupt public order. Because no complaints were lodged, no magistrate ever visited the property. Even among neighbors, the academy was seen as self-contained. Its stone walls and controlled routines kept attention away. Much of what is now known about the academy's early years comes from ledger books stored at a convent in Trois-Rivières. These documents, retrieved in the 1890s by a secular archivist, list names, birthplaces, and entry dates. Annotations in red ink suggest disciplinary actions, yet even these records omit departure explanations. Some boys are simply marked with the Latin word cessavit, he ceased. The meaning of that term remains debated. Some archivists argue it meant the student left voluntarily. Others suggest it indicated unrecorded removal. Regardless, by 1749, 12 entries bore this notation, all occurring within a span of 26 months. No formal dismissal notices exist. No exit interviews were documented. What makes the case unusual is not just the disappearances, but the consistency of silence. No written complaints appear in Quebec's seminary archives. No burial records exist for these 12 names in Rhode Island or surrounding colonies. The boys were not recorded as transfers to other institutions. Contemporary journals from missionaries make only passing references to disciplinary removals and conduct departures. No one named these 12 directly. In one note from 1751, a priest writing to his superior remarked, "We have resolved the matter of the troublesome pupils, but offered no detail. Even within the religious framework of the time, such omissions are difficult to explain." Catholic canon law required record-keeping for student progress and clerical training, yet for St. Casimir, enforcement was minimal. Its physical isolation and foreign funding allowed it to bypass colonial scrutiny. Chapter 1. Part 2 continues the detailed profile of St. Casimir's institutional operations and its administrative silence. The internal records of St. Casimir, once assumed to be lost, were not discovered until 1893, when a trunk of correspondence and ledgers was transferred from a dissolved religious property in Quebec to a diocesan archive. These materials were not formally reviewed until a cataloging project began decades later. By then, the school had long ceased operations and its name faded from institutional memory. What the documents revealed was a layered structure of permissions, external oversight in name only, and a rigid hierarchy that shielded faculty actions from civil interference. The personnel lists show a rotating presence of clerics, some staying as little as 6 months. While Father Besson remained the principal authority through the 12-year span, others were moved rapidly between North American and European posts. This made any continuity of governance difficult to trace. For most years, a third of the teaching staff had never previously served in the colonies. Their letters home, if they exist, reflect concerns more about climate and provisions than students or educational progress. One report, dated December 1748, was addressed to the seminary office in Reims. The author, a brother Theroux, described St. Casimir as formally adequate but spiritually stagnant. He commented on the students' language difficulties and observed that most boys lacked prior catechism. He did not reference any disciplinary incidents. However, marginalia added later in different ink read, "Replaceable in March." Whether this note applied to the brother himself or the referenced boys remains unclear. Architecturally, the school's design contributed to its insularity. The dormitories were sealed by a central corridor monitored from a single watchroom. Meals were taken in silence. Evening readings were led only by assigned clergy. The schedule left little opportunity for contact with the outside world. Students rarely left campus and only for escorted errands. Letters from parents or guardians were stored in an administrative drawer with few known replies. In the limited cases where a child's departure is mentioned, the phrasing remains non-committal. One entry from mid-1749 lists, "Lyonnais ceased attendance, item returned to store." No detail is offered. The same document records wine rations, candle usage, and linen inventories with greater specificity. This disproportion suggests a prioritization of material accounting over student documentation. The Academy's interactions with local officials were minimal. A solitary tax record notes that the school was exempt due to foreign clerical status. No assessments were conducted for health, curriculum, or discipline. The structure of colonial governance, while present, was decentralized. Unless public disruption occurred, authorities did not intervene in religious enterprises. A small number of boarding schools operated in nearby towns, yet none shared faculty or oversight with St. Casimir. This lack of interinstitutional communication allowed policies to vary widely. While some schools maintained registries of pupil advancement, St. Casimir relied on coded logs and verbal reporting. Besson's letters to Montreal consistently noted satisfactory conditions, but gave no names. His tone remained formal, almost formulaic, suggesting a routine devoid of individualized attention. The chapel, constructed alongside the main dormitory, was not open to the public. Masses were conducted internally, and only registered students and clergy were permitted entry. One witness, a supplier from Pawtuxet, described delivering flour to the rear gate, where crates were received by silent boys in matching coats. He was never invited beyond the threshold and noted no sound from within. This silence extended to alumni records. Of the 68 boys enrolled between 1742 and 1754, fewer than half appear in subsequent ecclesiastical directories or civil registers. Many, especially those listed as Cessavit, cannot be traced. Their parishes never received transfers. Their names do not reappear in baptismal sponsorships, marriage rolls, or burial plots. In rare moments, correspondence from external clergy alludes indirectly to student removal. A bishop's aide writing from New France in 1750 noted, "We have received no formal report from Providence this quarter, though we understand a return shipment of garments and books was made." This shipment coincides with the disappearance of 3 names from the ledger. The implication of departure without clarification formed a pattern. Records of medical personnel are non-existent. While common illnesses were noted in most boarding schools of the period, St. Casimir makes no mention of infirmary care, physicians, or quarantine measures. No apothecary bills were filed. A single line in a 1752 receipt lists tincture for discipline, though no dosage or purpose is described. The lack of documentation regarding student health is a notable omission. A review of supply orders reveals a focus on non-educational materials. Barrels of lime, hardware for locks, and crates of blank parchment appear frequently. By contrast, few books beyond religious texts were imported. This suggests a model centered more on containment and indoctrination than on general literacy. Testimonies collected by 19th-century archivists from descendants of former students paint an incomplete picture. One account, submitted anonymously to a Rhode Island Historical Society, describes a grandfather who had spent 2 years within the French house near Providence and was later discouraged from discussing his time there. No allegations are made, but the writer claims their ancestor never wrote a letter during his stay and returned changed, silent on the topic. Though these recollections are anecdotal and filtered through generations, they reflect a consistent absence of fond memory or institutional pride. No known student from St. Casimir advocated for its legacy. No reunion efforts or alumni appeals were initiated. Its closure received no public notice. When the Academy ended operations in 1754, it did so quietly. The last ledger page simply ends mid-column. A notation in French, fermé par ordre, is the final entry. No civil notice of disbandment was filed. The property was later absorbed by another religious order, which razed the building within a decade. No architectural plans remain. Archival documents from French Canada list St. Casimir among temporary mission schools, with a note that it was discontinued for logistical reasons. The term logistics was often used to describe a range of issues from staffing shortages to political tensions. No specific justification is recorded. What remains from St. Casimir's 12-year operation are partial records, absent students, and a pattern of administrative gaps. These elements, though individually ambiguous, collectively raise questions. The disappearance of 12 students within 2 years, marked only by a single word in the register, is statistically abnormal for the time. Yet no memorials, reports, or inquiries followed. The surrounding community, perhaps unaware or disempowered, did not intervene. The church hierarchy, dispersed and segmented, permitted local discretion. And the colonial system, focused on trade and expansion, had no mechanism for oversight of remote institutions. The boys listed as Cessavit were not recorded elsewhere. Their removal did not prompt replacement or adjustment. Their names faded from both religious and civic record-keeping. Without accusations, there was no need for defense. Without documentation, there was no evidence to protect. What end they met remains unknown. Their absence is felt not in what was said, but in what was never written. Ignored signs. In the years immediately surrounding 1750, St. Casimir Academy presented an image of continuity. It operated with unchanging schedules and regular shipments, but beneath the surface, certain details suggest that those closest to the institution may have observed irregularities, even if they never gave them formal voice. These observations came not from within the religious structure, but from its periphery. The tailor contracted to supply the academy with uniforms, a Protestant tradesman from Pawtuxet named Elijah Grove, maintained a private invoice book now housed at the Rhode Island Historical Register. In it, orders are listed seasonally. Invoices from 1743 through 1748 show quantities consistent with an average enrollment of 60 students. But beginning in mid-1749, a pattern emerges. Grove's book shows uniform orders for fewer than 50 boys, even though the Academy's external communications continued to claim enrollment at full capacity. When Grove noted the discrepancy in his margin, he speculated that some pupils may no longer require new garments. He did not pursue the question. Another vendor, a merchant named Jonathan Leake, who supplied oil for chapel lamps, documented a similar reduction in delivery volume. Beginning in the spring of 1750, the quantity of ordered oil fell by nearly 20%. Leake, in his own ledger, wrote that the priests claimed they had found means to economize. The explanation was accepted without dispute, as payments remained punctual. This outward punctuality kept suppliers cooperative. None appears to have raised concern beyond private notes, but when reviewed together, these vendor accounts point to a subtle contraction within the Academy, one not acknowledged in official statements, yet clearly visible in the Academy's operational footprint. The Academy's own garden staff also provides an indirect trace. Though most labor was performed by students under supervision, St. Casimir occasionally contracted local field hands during harvest periods. One such laborer, a man named Robert Corley, was hired briefly in late 1749. In a recorded oral history collected nearly a century later, Corley's grandson described hearing that his grandfather worked several days among quiet boys, but was told not to speak with them unless instructed. While this reflects common discipline practices of the period, the retelling notes that Corley found the place hushed in a strange way, a phrase repeated in multiple family accounts. Another voice comes from within church circles. In a letter archived in the Jesuit records of Montreal, dated January 1751, a priest named François de Lille wrote to a superior describing a visit to St. Casimir. Though most of his commentary is theological, he includes a logistical note. Of those enrolled, I met no more than 42. The remainder were said to be with the fields or in correction. The silence was observed with care. He makes no judgment, but his observation conflicts with the reported numbers sent to the diocesan office only weeks earlier. These fragments, when isolated, suggest nothing actionable. But as patterns, they form a consistent mismatch between declared enrollment and observed presence. Despite this, no external authority challenged the school's accounting. The reasons for this inaction can be found in the structure of authority at the time. St. Casimir operated under a transatlantic charter. Its accountability was vertical, not local. This meant that while it occupied colonial land, its spiritual oversight was hundreds of miles north, and its financial records were managed in French currency. Few colonial magistrates had the jurisdiction or the interest to intervene in matters that did not affect property law or civil order. Additionally, the boys enrolled at St. Casimir often had no local advocates. Many came from transient or displaced families. Some were sent from other colonies without follow-up. A student entered the school, and from the public records perspective, was no longer visible. The structure discouraged inquiries. Parish priests who sent boys to Providence rarely kept contact. Letters home, when written, passed through clerical filters. Parents without literacy or legal standing had little recourse if correspondence stopped. There is no documented instance of a family demanding investigation. Whether this reflects trust in the clergy, fear of reprisal, or simple resignation is not recorded. But the absence of formal complaints became, in effect, a protective barrier for the institution. The lack of protest was interpreted as proof of stability, yet hints of disquiet did occasionally surface. In the autumn of 1752, a visiting cleric named Father Corbinet delivered a homily in a nearby parish in which he referred to the weight of oversight and the gravity of care entrusted to educators. In his travel notes, later copied into a monastic register, he remarked that St. Casimir bears an atmosphere of restraint greater than I have seen elsewhere. The tone is guarded but suggestive. Another unusual trace comes from a letter intercepted by British colonial authorities in Massachusetts during routine mail inspection. Dated March 1753, the letter was from a former staff member at St. Casimir, now assigned to a school near Trois-Rivières. The author, whose name was redacted in the surviving document, wrote, "I reflect daily on what was asked of us in Providence. The silence became its own rule." The letter does not mention students' disappearances or specific actions, but the phrasing echoes that found in other internal notes from the time. This consistent reference to silence, appearing across unrelated sources, suggests a cultivated institutional ethos. Within the academy, speech was regulated, correspondence was screened, and reporting followed only designated channels. Even within the clergy, the expectation of restraint created a climate where abnormal events could be processed internally without triggering outside attention. A rare exception comes in the form of a visitor's diary. Reverend Sylvester Arno, an English convert and traveller, passed through Providence in late 1753. His published journal includes a short passage on St. Casimir, which he called a stone enclosure of foreign order, nearly monastic in bearing. He claimed to have been denied entrance, but spoke with a local baker who supplied bread weekly. According to Arnaud, the baker described the students as diminished in number though more orderly than before. The quote lacks detail but implies a change in tone or discipline. None of these accounts presents evidence of misconduct. Yet each registers a deviation from expected norms: reduced uniforms, smaller rations, silent boys, a narrowed footprint, an absent record of departures. These markers, while administrative on the surface, suggest that the institution's operations diverged from its stated practices beginning in 1749. No alarm was raised. No inquiries were launched. What warnings existed were diffuse, indirect, and ultimately ignored. The mechanisms for concern were present in name only. The institution's autonomy, protected by its charter and reinforced by deference to religious authority, prevented any form of investigation. The rhythm of deliveries continued. Clergy were reassigned. The walls remained intact, and within them, questions went unanswered. Within the administrative structure of St. Casimir Academy, records remained minimal by design. The limited written output served to control perception as much as to document function. Ledgers tracked supplies with precision, but personal histories were reduced to initials and annotations. The language of formality replaced specificity. Any deviation from routine, however minor, was described in institutional shorthand. The practice of coded notation was common in religious orders of the time, particularly in remote settings. A series of internal glossaries found in the Trois-Rivières archives includes abbreviations used in monastic reports, among them IA for indicia absentia, meaning signs of absence, QS for quietus status, indicating neutral behavior, and TF for transferred fictus, a term whose meaning remains disputed but may refer to unenrolled removal. Several of these appear in the margins of St. Casimir's ledger, without elaboration. One recurring code MC followed by a numeral has no confirmed translation. In 12 entries between 1749 and 1751, the code appears next to students later marked as Cessavit. The numbers range from 1 to 5. Later correspondence from a regional cleric in Acadia refers to MC classification as used at the Providence House, but offers no interpretation. The lack of key documentation prevents full understanding. Beyond the records, the physical grounds of St. Casimir offered few opportunities for observation. The rear courtyard, bounded by tall stone walls, faced wooded land that remained undeveloped until well into the next century. A narrow path led to the town road, but was used primarily by suppliers. No formal gatehouse existed. Students were not permitted outside unless accompanied. One map drawn in 1755, after the school had closed, shows only a footprint of the structure with no reference to outbuildings. In the 1890s, during a short-lived archival survey of early colonial institutions, a researcher named Harold Blythe interviewed elderly residents of Providence whose families had lived near the former academy grounds. Their recollections, though vague, describe quiet Sundays, rare sightings of boys, and evening bells without ceremony. A woman born in 1811, whose father once sold cider to the clergy, recalled being told never to speak of the stone schoolhouse. The warning was passed without explanation. In the surviving correspondence between academy staff and their regional superiors, one recurring theme is the emphasis on external perception. Phrases like "conduct remains exemplary," "routine unaltered," and "no disruptions to report" occur regularly. These lines, often repeated verbatim across letters, suggest either a strict reporting template or deliberate reassurance. The repetition implies a concern with consistency more than transparency. One letter dated October 1751, from Father Besson to his diocesan liaison, contains a single irregular line: "We proceed in the manner directed. Alterations, if made, remain unnoted." The context is unclear. No preceding report references a directive. No subsequent reply acknowledges the statement. The line is followed by an inventory of candles and starch. This same letter includes a list of students under the heading "Currently Lodged." The number is 38. Previous reports from the same year claimed enrollment of 61. No explanation is offered for the reduction. In the absence of protest or inquiry, these inconsistencies persisted unchallenged. The academy's location, removed from commercial centers, insulated it from casual oversight. Clergy passed through on assignment, few staying more than 2 years. Visiting ecclesiastical inspectors, if they came, left no surviving reports. A local tradition passed orally among shopkeepers into the early 1800s held that the bells of the academy rang not to mark time, but to signal internal movements. Several merchants recalled hearing bells at unexpected intervals, sometimes as late as midnight. While this may reflect standard liturgical practice, it stands out in a colony where Anglican and congregational customs dominated. Another irregularity involves the chapel's altar stone. In a later record from the Society for the Preservation of Colonial Artifacts, a note describes the removal of a carved block from the ruins of the St. Casimir property in 1798. The stone, inscribed in Latin, bore the phrase "non indicabit nisi solum." The line translates roughly as "none shall declare but the ground itself." While not uncommon in funerary inscriptions, its use in an altar setting is atypical. The stone was later repurposed as a foundation element in a church across the river. This inscription, while symbolic, reflects the academy's broader ethos of containment. St. Casimir's structure, both physical and administrative, operated on selective communication. Student voices were not preserved. Parental correspondence, if retained, was not included in the archived materials. Faculty records rarely mentioned individual boys by name beyond the initial registration. In one of the few existing disciplinary logs, written in French, a line records, "Instruction given, no further note." Another reads, "Confined until further guidance. Action recorded elsewhere." The implication of external documentation is unsupported by the remaining records. No reference documents have been found. By 1753, student references in the ledger grow sparse. That year's entries focus instead on maintenance, repair of window shutters, and acquisition of new ledger books. The final student annotation appears in April of that year, listing initials and the phrase "cessavit sub silentio." This phrasing, which does not appear elsewhere in the log, translates as "ceased under silence." No additional enrollment entries follow. The months that remain in the ledger are filled with supply counts and liturgical schedules. By early 1754, even those notations stop. The last financial line item is dated May 2nd, listing compensation for carriers. The closure of the academy, if formally declared, is not recorded in colonial records. A general ledger from the Diocese of Quebec simply notes, "Providence property released from obligation." The lack of ceremonial language suggests administrative termination rather than scandal or dissolution. In the generations that followed, the land was subdivided, sold and repurposed. No memorials mark the former institution. A single tree, believed to have stood in the original courtyard, was felled in the 1830s during road expansion. In 1904, a researcher attempting to compile a census of pre-revolutionary Catholic institutions in New England wrote that St. Casimir left behind neither student rolls nor testimonial documents. His entry on the academy spans 2 sentences. The 12 students marked with disappearance codes in 1749 and 1750 do not reappear in any baptismal records, wills, or religious registries under alternate spellings. No death notices were filed. No formal expulsion letters exist. They are absent from every traceable archive. Despite the consistency of this absence, the Academy's administrators faced no inquiry. Their silence was not judged as failure, nor was it even measured. The systems that surrounded them were not designed to seek contradiction. They received updates, approved reports, and made assignments, but they did not investigate. In the world of colonial clerical education, authority flowed in one direction, and silence, once established, sustained itself. Truth revealed. The formal silence surrounding St. Casimir Academy remained intact for over a century. During that time, references to the school appeared sporadically in clerical footnotes or logistical inventories, but no investigation into its operations was ever conducted. The location was repurposed, the name forgotten. What ultimately broke that silence came not from public pressure or judicial inquiry, but from a procedural misfiling in a diocesan archive thousands of miles away. In 1881, a clerical assistant assigned to organize the episcopal registries of northern France found among the ledgers a bound folio marked Récollet, Américaine, 1740-1760. Though misfiled under a defunct order, the volume contained translated correspondence from North American institutions, including St. Casimir. It had been stored in the seminary archives of Lyon, transferred from Montreal decades earlier, and mislabeled during transit. The folio's contents included carbon copies of letters between Father Lionel Besson and his superior in the Diocese of Reims. Several of these letters, written in French and copied in Latin, describe routine operations at the Academy. However, interspersed among them were memoranda labeled "restricted," with a notation indicating their content was not to be entered into parish logs. These memoranda contained details not reflected in any previously known documentation. One, dated August 1749, lists the names of 6 students followed by the phrase, "removed under discretion of order." No cause is cited. A second, dated 11 months later, lists 5 additional names, similarly labeled. A final entry from July 1751 lists a 12th name and bears a different annotation. Departure noted, classification MC4, no reintegration recommended. The appearance of this specific code, identical to that found in the original Providence Ledger, allowed archivists to confirm the link. These documents did not describe wrongdoing. They used technical phrasing, often vague, to report internal decisions. Still, their mere existence indicated that departures were known, recorded, and acknowledged beyond the local level. This contradicted previous claims that the students had left without official notice. One of the archivists assigned to the project, Henri Delame, began cross-referencing the names in these memoranda with regional baptismal records, hoping to trace any reappearance in the clerical network. None were found. When Delame raised the issue with a supervising canon, he was advised to mark the matter as incomplete provenance and continue with the inventory. No follow-up was ordered. Delame, however, kept private notes. These included hypotheses about the meaning of MC based on similar terminology used in early missionary communities. One theory linked it to modificatio canonica, a phrase used to denote removal from religious care without formal expulsion. Though circumstantial, this interpretation would explain the absence of follow-up entries or relocation notices. The term implied discretion, not punishment, and required no external reporting. In 1885, Delarme submitted a sealed document to the Société Historique de la Charente, a regional historical society, outlining his findings. His submission was noted in the Society's minutes, but never published. The Society's leadership, largely composed of retired clergy, voted to withhold the document from their annual bulletin, citing its unfinished character. The sealed file remained in storage for 72 years, unopened. Interest in the case resurfaced in 1957, when a doctoral student from the University of Ottawa named Colette Marchand conducted a dissertation on clerical education during the colonial period. During a research trip to France, she was granted access to auxiliary files from the Charente Society, where she discovered Delarme's sealed report. With permission, she opened the file and transcribed its contents. Marchand's notes confirm the structure and wording of the memoranda. In her dissertation appendix, she includes direct quotations, carefully translated. One entry reads, "Student L. de P., aged 12, removed from Providence residence under coordination. No ceremony conducted, no record instructed." Another states, "Final annotation, MC3, no re-entry, archive line closed." These phrases do not accuse, but they imply a level of planning and permanence not previously associated with the institution's departures. The language of closure, coordination, and omission stands in contrast to the Academy's prior reputation for routine. Marchand attempted to contact the Diocese of Lyon for further clarification, but was informed that the original folio had since been transferred to Rome. No response was received from the Vatican archive. Her dissertation remained academic, read only by a small circle of historians. Yet it marked the first time that documentation directly referencing the 12 missing students had entered the public domain. In the years that followed, independent researchers began to revisit the question of St. Casmir's enrollment records. One such researcher, Alan Dorrance, gained access to the Rhode Island Colonial Land Register in the early 1970s. There he found a series of notations related to the school's property sale following its closure. One deed, filed in 1755, references uninhabited structure previously used for clerical instruction, presently vacant. The deed includes an inventory of fixed goods remaining on site, among them a chest labeled Référence Internes. This chest is not accounted for in any known religious inventory, nor was it included in the property's final sale listing. Its contents were never described. The chest does not appear in later archival materials. Dorrance published a short monograph in 1976, proposing that this missing container may have held internal reports or correspondence explaining the Academy's final years. He does not speculate on the nature of the disappearances, but argues that the absence of institutional preservation indicates either deliberate omission or clerical oversight. In response, the Rhode Island Ecclesiastical Review published a counterstatement in 1977 reaffirming the Academy's legitimacy and warning against historical conjecture. The statement, signed by a panel of diocesan archivists, described the missing student entries as historically unfortunate but inconclusive. No further discussion was encouraged. Despite this, references to the missing boys began appearing in regional historical lectures. In 1983, a commemorative address at the Providence Library included a reading of the original 12 names, drawn from the Quebec Ledger and matched against baptismal lists. The address called for acknowledgement, not accusation, framing the matter as a case study in institutional absence rather than misconduct. To this day, no death certificates, burial entries, or confirmed resettlement records for the 12 students have been located. Their identities are confirmed only through enrollment logs, delivery orders, and internal memoranda. What these materials reveal is not a singular event, but a procedural pattern, one that allowed for removal without external record, sanctioned by administrative code, and maintained through layers of geographic and clerical distance. The lack of protest from families, officials, or church authorities may have stemmed from the social and political structure of the time. But the consistency of a mission, replicated across distinct sources and jurisdictions, suggests not mere oversight, but a sustained model of discretionary separation. In the logic of the institution, the decisions made were valid. Each departure was marked, logged, and closed. No explanatory note was deemed necessary. No external communication was authorized. The structure functioned as intended. It was only centuries later, when independent records converged and archival barriers were lowered, that a pattern became visible. The silence had not been accidental. It had been designed. 1-2. Legacy and silence. In the decades following the Academy's closure, the land that once held St. Casimir was gradually absorbed by private holdings. A deed from 1768 notes the transfer of 2 acres formerly in religious use to a local merchant, who converted the site into a supply depot for timber. By 1790, the original limestone structure had been dismantled. Its stones, hauled in pieces to the Providence waterfront, were reused in the foundation of a custom shed. No marker remained on the original site. For over a century, no organized effort was made to record or commemorate the school's presence. Its brief existence, obscured by shifting property records and clerical dispersals, remained unnoted in civic documents. The name appeared only occasionally in lists of closed religious outposts compiled for ecclesiastical reviews. In those summaries, St. Casimir was listed without dates or details, a placeholder for a forgotten operation. This absence suited the administrative culture of the period. Institutions that left no formal grievance, no external dispute, and no open legal action were not subject to inquiry. The Academy, by virtue of its silence, retained a neutral legacy. Among archivists and cataloguers, it became an example of an operational entry without narrative. It existed in forms, but not in story. In the 1890s, when a regional historian named Marguerite Allen undertook a survey of early educational institutions in Rhode Island, she included a 2-page reference to St. Casimir based solely on property maps and diocesan indexes. She noted the lack of surviving student records and attributed the omissions to fire or decay. Her manuscript, published locally, was the first to mention the Academy by name since its closure. It was not until the early 20th century that researchers began to connect the absence of records with the names of missing students. These names, rediscovered through indirect notations in supply ledgers and secondary archives, prompted renewed interest. Still, that interest remained confined to academic settings. Public awareness of the Academy's history remained limited. In 1936, during the tricentennial celebrations of Providence's founding, a committee tasked with identifying historic educational sites omitted St. Casimir from its report. A footnote in the appendix states that no physical trace or instructional documentation survives. The committee considered inclusion unnecessary. By 1950, references to the Academy appeared primarily in footnotes of dissertations and minor journals. The case was cited as an example of underdocumented institutions in colonial North America. Rarely was the issue of the 12 names addressed directly. More often, the matter was presented as an archival gap. That framing began to shift in the 1970s, following the reappearance of letters from Father Besson and the memoranda recovered in France. The convergence of source material made it clear that the departures were not informal or forgotten, but recorded through coded systems. Still, without any formal acknowledgement from modern religious authorities, interpretation remained constrained. During this period, efforts to identify descendants of the 12 students yielded limited results. Census data from the 18th century was incomplete. Family names were often abbreviated, altered or lost in transliteration. Of the 12, only 5 names were complete enough to trace through regional baptismal records. In each case, no further documentation followed their enrollment at the Academy. Local initiatives to mark the site of the former school were met with indifference. A 1982 proposal by the Rhode Island Historical Cartography Association to install a small plaque near the presumed location was deferred indefinitely. The City Council minutes note, unclear historical value, and recommend additional review. No action was taken. That same year, a radio broadcast aired a short segment on forgotten buildings of colonial Providence. St. Casimir was mentioned only briefly, and the missing students were not referenced. The focus remained on architectural loss rather than institutional record. The idea that the Academy's silence reflected deliberate record-keeping rather than absence of activity remained a minority view. Among archivists, the lack of official complaint or disciplinary action was often cited as a reason to avoid speculation. The narrative defaulted to uncertainty. Despite this, independent researchers continued to assemble cross-references. In 1991, a linguistics professor named Eliza Grafton published an article examining the terminology used in St. Casimir's ledgers. Her analysis of the phrase "cessavit sub silentio" argued that the wording carried procedural weight. Grafton linked the expression to other colonial records in which the same Latin structure denoted irrevocable administrative closure. She proposed that the phrase may have been part of a formalized but unpublished protocol. Her article received limited attention outside academic circles, but it introduced a methodological shift. The discussion no longer centered on whether the disappearances occurred, but on how they were documented. The evidence pointed not to neglect, but to intention. This conclusion remained academically cautious. None of the published studies implied misconduct. The consistent terminology, administrative pattern, and lack of re-entry for the 12 names were interpreted through the lens of institutional process. Yet questions persisted. Why were no explanations filed? Why were no receiving institutions listed? Why did none of the boys reappear in subsequent records? In 2006, the first public exhibition to mention the Academy opened at the Providence Colonial Archive. The exhibit, titled Absent Names, Education and Documentation in Early Rhode Island, included a panel referencing the 12 students. It presented a facsimile of the original ledger and a map of the school grounds. A placard beneath the display read, "No conclusions are drawn. This display is for consideration." The exhibit remained on display for 6 months. During that time, visitors left over 50 written comments in a designated book. Many expressed confusion about the lack of information. Others questioned how an entire school could operate without oversight. A few suggested further research, though none proposed formal inquiry. In 2011, a local author published a historical novel loosely inspired by the records. The book, while fictional, brought renewed attention to the topic. However, its dramatization of events drew criticism from archivists, who noted the dangers of conflating imagination with documented fact. The author, in interviews, emphasized that the story was speculative and based on open questions, not conclusions. In the years since, public awareness has increased incrementally. Mentions of St. Casimir now appear in educational timelines and archival databases. Still, no commemorative marker has been installed. No formal investigation has been undertaken by religious authorities. The property remains privately owned. The 12 names, once buried in codes and omissions, are now indexed in historical directories. They are not confirmed to have met any specific fate. They are not described in official reports. Their last appearances remain in institutional notations, recorded with measured phrasing and sealed by time. The absence of further commentary was part of the model. The institution did not deny. It simply did not explain. The absence of formal resolution has not prevented the records from circulating among researchers. Since 2015, digital reproductions of the St. Casimir ledger, including the 12 annotated entries, have appeared in open-access archives managed by historical consortiums. Each entry retains its original language. Annotations remain unmodified. The term "cessavit" appears unchanged, followed by the coded notations whose meanings are still debated. A footnote added by a modern archivist explains that the codes, though not standardized, suggest a procedural framework specific to that institution. The note offers no interpretation. Its inclusion signals both the persistence of questions and the limits of explanation. At academic conferences, the case is now used to illustrate archival boundary conditions, the point at which surviving records cease to support narrative closure. Discussions often center on metadata, frequency of record-keeping, consistency of terminology, and the administrative language of omission. The students themselves, while present in name, remain abstracted through data points. In this abstraction lies the story's endurance. Without testimony or contemporaneous investigation, the case remains defined by absence. It resists conclusion, and in doing so, continues to raise procedural questions. How many similar institutions operated under comparable systems? How many records were coded or sequestered under internal mandates? How many departures were recorded but never explained? The ledger's phrasing, especially in its closing entries, reflects a finality incompatible with recovery. The phrase "archive line closed," repeated in 2 of the 12 entries, implies deliberate administrative conclusion. It does not suggest loss or confusion. It implies task completion. This phrasing has influenced current archival training. Several institutions now use the St. Casimir case as a model for evaluating historical notation practices. In professional courses, students are asked to analyze the ledger without access to contextual history, testing their ability to infer structure from syntax. The exercise highlights how easily administrative neutrality can obscure narrative content. Yet beyond academic circles, little movement has occurred. The case has never entered public curriculum. It has not been adopted by civic memorial efforts. The story, while accessible, has not translated into commemorative action. In 2019, a private citizen installed a temporary marker near the suspected location of the Academy's original west wall. The marker, affixed to a wooden post, bore the 12 names hand-painted on a metal plate. Below the names, a single sentence was etched: removed, recorded, unreturned. Within 3 weeks, the marker was taken down. No notice was filed. Local authorities later confirmed the installation had not been authorized. No fines were issued. The incident was recorded in a maintenance report, but received no public mention. The metal plate was not recovered. Since then, informal observances have occurred each year on the date corresponding to the final ledger entry. Small gatherings of independent historians and students place stones along the sidewalk near the site. They do not speak or present materials. No organization sponsors the events. Participants have explained the gesture as a form of procedural acknowledgement. The focus is not on mourning or accusation, but on the act of recording. One attendee described it as an effort to preserve the act of noticing. Another referred to it as ledger correction without narrative. In 2022, the Rhode Island State Archive commissioned a report on undocumented educational institutions. The resulting document includes a full appendix on St. Casimir, listing all 12 students with their enrollment dates, last known ledger annotations, and absence of relocation records. The report concludes with the following statement: no current archival pathway leads to resolution. Documentation remains static. This statement, while accurate, reinforces the case's enduring character. As long as no new records emerge and no institutions offer further information, the historical model remains closed. Its silence, preserved through meticulous procedural formality, continues to shape its reception. In that sense, the Academy's design proved effective. By relying on coded notation, remote oversight, and restricted correspondence, it ensured that any departures, intentional or otherwise, could be folded into a clerical framework that required no public response. The method left behind no overt contradiction, only absences difficult to define. The persistence of this model raises broader questions about how institutional records can serve as both documentation and concealment. When phrased formally, even the most permanent changes can be recorded as routine. When coded appropriately, final decisions can pass without comment. Today, the legacy of St. Casimir is not measured through material remains. No stone walls survive. No curriculum texts endure. Its influence exists in notations, methodologies, and preserved formats. It is an institution known not for what it did, but for how it ended its own record. Each of the 12 names now appears in regional digital archives under individual headings. Each is tagged with the notation, "Last recorded at St. Casimir Academy, status unresolved." Researchers who encounter these entries must rely on marginalia and extrapolation. The students remain identified by initials, age, and a final coded line. Efforts to extrapolate from related institutions have produced limited results. While some orders maintained more detailed exit protocols, others employed similar discretionary codes. Without cross-reference, the terms lose alignment. In that vacuum, speculation is discouraged. The archival field now treats the case as structurally closed. The one known surviving artifact linked directly to the Academy, the altar stone reused in a local parish, remains unmarked. In 2020, a researcher confirmed its placement beneath the pulpit of a church, founded decades after the school's closure. When questioned, parish staff acknowledged the stone's origin, but indicated no plans to alter or display it. This decision mirrors the broader approach, acknowledgement without disruption. The institution's past is visible only through procedural fragments, not through active reconstruction. No party has moved to challenge or reinterpret its narrative. What remains is the trace, a ledger, a code, a record that ends not with denial or omission, but with formal closure. In that ending, the Academy found its most enduring act. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. This story is fictional. All names have been edited to protect the source. This video is for entertainment purposes only. But here's a disclaimer. It's based on historical facts,